email address or internet access for more than 5 years? Anybody? 1, 2, 3. That's actually quite a bit. That's a lot. David's website has been up since 1993. The Watcher website. It's mt.net/watcher. And it's one of the most, because it's so old, it's one of the most linked to sites on the internet. They do great on the search engines. It's also one of the most copied, that their material has been used in other people's work and on and on. Sometimes they say where it came from, sometimes it doesn't. Everybody in this community knows the Watcher website, but nobody knows who he is. So Dave has finally got a book, and this is his first public speaking appearance. But I was thinking earlier, for this conference and him being here, and I wish Brenda were here, she deserves this too. I was like, if I could give anybody a Lifetime Achievement Award for UFOs and the Bible, I'd want to give it to them. And then I got to thinking, there's nobody here today that I wouldn't have to give that to, though. So that's why you don't get an award, but we're glad to have you. This is David Flynn.
Thanks a lot, Guy. That was most humbling. Well, I listened to the first speaker, and I was really impressed with what he said about how science shouldn't be coupled with religion when it comes to studying the UFO phenomenon. And I did a little deductive reasoning early in this research when I was 11 years old, living in Montana, seeing UFOs firsthand, watching the news, seeing them, and I was fascinated by the idea that something like that would exist. And I was told that it's fringe science, it's kooky, you don't want to put it together with science because you're going to end up with no understanding. And that's a paradox, because the farther back in time you go from our modern era, the closer that science and religion seem to merge together. So that even 200 years ago, there was really no distinction between astrology and astronomy. And you go back a few more hundred years, you'll find that the greatest philosophers and scientific minds coupled their religious beliefs and their knowledge base from how close they could get to the heavens. So today, our ultimate experience as a scientist would be to stand on the moon. In 400 BC, and even 400 years later than that, you end up seeing people look at the religious experience of standing on the moon as the ultimate mystic achievement. So now we're faced with a development that goes even beyond the UFO phenomena. This idea that there may be actual artificial structures found on Mars. And instead of looking at it from a purely empirical scientific view, I decided I would look at it from the religious viewpoint, but not just the theological Christian viewpoint. I would look at it from several different theological viewpoints. And I ended up looking at some people who showed me that I didn't have to reinvent the wheel. I found that the Neoplatonists and the Neo-Pythagoreans back in the 4th century AD had actually combined all of the proto-philosophers, the most incredible thinkers of the early civilization, and combined them and realized that the greatest knowledge had come from above. That was their litany. Everything had already been thought up in heaven according to them, and then propagated downward by entities with actual personalities. And this really took a huge explosion after, in the Library of Alexandria, they added the Septuagint, the translation of the ancient Hebrew scriptures, into Greek. And the Hellenistic Empire, when they were able to connect with that, they started repeating the patterns in heaven, pulling them down to earth in a thing called theurgy, which is just akin to metallurgy, molding themselves to the forces outside that were, to them, gods, theos. I'm a Christian, so when I looked at that, I immediately recognized that they're not dealing with the God Almighty. They're dealing with an echelon underneath him. And their moral alignment is not with God at all. And the more I looked at it, the more it pointed to two distinct places. It pointed to Genesis 3. It pointed to the first encounter of a human being with an angelic being. And then it pointed to Mars. And I can explain this best with pictures. This is Cydonia. It's a frame taken in 1976 by the Viking 1 probe. There's a couple surface anomalies here. The most famous is right here. An anthropomorphic face. When this first came out, even the people in NASA and JPL had a hard time dealing with it because they thought it was just an artifact, a photographic artifact, something that you would see with just a trick of light and shadow. And they were pretty glib in their dismissal of this because there's more to this picture than just the face. Over to the right, you see a wall on a blast crater with detritus moving out from the exterior, and that's anomalous because if this thing was intact at the time of the impact of the crater, which broke loose all this detritus, and now we actually know that there's probably ice frozen under the dust there, it would have left a blast shadow here, which doesn't exist. There's also geometric alignments between this wall and the interesting tetrahedral mound you'll see on this crater, which also shouldn't be there because geomorphically it doesn't make sense to have an edifice like that on a crater that's created by an impact. There's this mound here that's been also discovered that if you would extend a line to the wall and also to this crater, you end up with the infamous 19.5, or actually 19.47, that angle between these lines that's repeated throughout the face. An object here, which is a 1.6 mile long, 5-sided pyramid, which is hard to see here, but I have other pictures that rectify it a lot more clearly. And this is a city complex. Richard Hoagland had dubbed the city complex with some very regular geometric shapes. And it's a regular geometric pattern that seems to indicate that there's some artificiality present. There's another view of it. And you can see the face a little bit more resolved here. And then at the city complex, there's some regular pyramids that seem to almost be like a sighting line to the face. And if you're able to see where that wall was that I was talking about earlier, it creates an actual artificial horizon for you to view it. And this is actually oriented, or was oriented at one time at east-west fashion, so that if this had some function as a residence for who knows who, they could have actually viewed the sun moving across this area, almost like a solstice marker. I remember seeing this picture when I was in Safeway. It was in the Inquirer. The first time I ever encountered it. And I have an inquiring mind, so I was intrigued. And I realized that there was more to it because happily they included the information that there was other geometric structures nearby. And that piqued my interest because repeating geometric patterns are the signs of intelligence. You can't just have one face anomaly like this and say, oh, that's evidence of an artificial life form on Mars. But the interesting thing about the earlier philosophers and theurgy, that word that I'm going to use over and over again, is they look at the past and in their present age and then the future in the same way, within that framework of the idea that they're always pulling down the influence of beings, of angelic forces that dictate what they're going to do, that pattern what they're going to accomplish in life. They would look at this achievement of our imaging this close up to Mars as the greatest theurgic triumph This is a map of Giovanni Schiaparelli from 1877. He wasn't the first person to actually map Mars, but his surface feature names are the ones that are most intact today. One of the reasons is because at his age, in his age, the telescopes were advanced enough to resolve the surface features, and he had the fortune of being alive during a time of one of the closest passes of Mars to the Earth, where you could actually see the surface features well enough to be able to name them. The zero meridian is incredibly important in this theurgic scenario, this heaven-earth alignment that the early philosophers understood.
Because the meridian is your benchmark. It can actually be your benchmark
from space to the planet that you're looking at. It was actually established by two German astronomers, Wilhelm Beer and Johann Madler, in 1830 to 1832, and they were able to put the prime meridian of Mars along a surface feature that was dark. It was later dubbed Sinus Meridani. But Giovanni Schiaparelli put the place names on it. And the place names are incredibly important because they fit into theurgy. They are what is called in modern times mystical toponymy. To have a name that means something and have it placed in space and time on a planet is incredibly a religious and scientific and a Gnostic sort of idea. We take it for granted now that we have place names all over the United States that are akin to ancient places in Rome and Paris and ancient Greece. But to have Cydonia marked perfectly over the prime meridian, right here, is what I like to draw your attention to, because a prime meridian is where it all starts. And Cydonia is the area where the anomalies, the artificial-looking structures, have appeared. In this picture, this would be north, and this would be south. The Giovanni is using a reflecting telescope, so it's reversed and upside down. And you can also see, instead of like on the Earth, we have 180 degrees, and the international dateline in the back of the globe. On Mars, it goes all the way around 360 degrees and ends at zero again. Here's a closer picture of how well Cydonia was placed over the map. An astronomer would be the greatest philosopher 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. Now we look at them as the greatest empiricists, the greatest scientists. They don't merge together any longer, and I think that's hamstrung our understanding of the UFO phenomena, and definitely will hamstring our understanding of Cydonia if we can't use the framework that they established already. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Schiaparelli also was an avid spiritist. He actually went to seances with his contemporaries, Camille Flammarion and Percival Lowell. And Camille Flammarion actually went on record as saying that anyone who says that spiritism and the supernatural do not exist speak as one who has no understanding. He knew it because he had actual experience with it, and he would take his empiricism and his scientific knowledge and actually qualify it and quantify it. And then he wrote a lot of books on it, and not just his encounters with the medium Eusebia Palermo, who lived in Milan at the time, with also Giovanni Schiaparelli, but also in his experiences in Japan. And later, Giovanni Schiaparelli actually wrote about astronomy in the New Testament and its mystical significance. So here's the theurgic connection to Earth. Cydonia is on the prime meridian of Mars. Let's look at the prime meridian of Earth. The prime meridian was actually established as a universal benchmark in 1844 by Allen Chester Arthur, 21st President of the United States, in Washington. And all the nations at that time gathered together in Washington and said that they would agree that that would be the place in Greenwich that they would establish the universal meridian, zero. As you can see, the center of time and space. This is a religious philosophy, even though now it's understood as just pure scientific, but it is a religious philosophy. To mirror heavens on the earth and to anchor them this way. Without a prime meridian, we can't establish where we are on the globe. There has to be a fixed benchmark in heaven. Looking at it closer, the prime meridian goes through England, the island of Britain. And particularly in this area, you find some of the greatest megalithic sites in the world. And I'm drawing your attention to the megalithic sites of the world because these are the anomalous artificial structures on our Earth that stand out. They're enigmas still. In the Wiltshire area, we have the greatest earth mound in the world, the Silbury Hill, which I think is right there. And north is the Avebury Circle, which is the greatest earth circle in the whole entire world. And this area, the surface features of this area have been contoured. The actual age of the structures is said to be 2600 BC, but they're built in certain stages. This is also the area where the majority of the crop circle phenomena occurs. This is the Silbury Hill. It's 520 feet across and 130 feet high. That flat mountain, the flat place that you see at the top of it is about 100 feet across. There's been excavations down the center of it looking for burial chambers. There's been theories that it's a geodetic marker, that you can cite different spaces on the topography of Britain, but it really doesn't fit into any of these paradigms. This is the Avebury Circle. It's about 1,500 feet across. When it was first constructed, it was about 30 feet deep, the trench was, and the mound on the exterior rim was about 15 feet high. This gives you a little idea of the scale. There's gentlemen walking among the stones which are unhewn. Some of them are 20 to 30 tons and stand almost 12 feet high. And an artist's rendition of what it looked like when it was first constructed. Because it was constructed in the Bronze Age, he's clad these humans in goat skins, which I think is a little strange because it looks like a bulldozer went through to put the thing together. And I don't know how these guys could have moved 20-ton boulders in this geometric arrangement, or why they would waste all that time. They got a lot of goat hides to chew and cows to milk. And this is the thing. This is the Cydonia analog of what we're looking at Wiltshire. In 1991, a man named David S. Percy decided to take an ordnance map of the same area in England and shrink the Cydonia region down to approximately 1/14 of the size of what the England site was, so that he could superimpose the features. And this is actually a satellite picture of the Avebury area. This is the Avebury Circle here, and the causeway that goes out of it, and the Silbury Hill. This is the crater on Mars with the tetrahedral pyramid on it, and the mound, or the thallus. These are some surface features that aren't mentioned in the maps, but you can see the regularity that these features appear in both places. And this is a comparison of the Cydonia thallus and its analog on the Avebury plain. You can see that there's actually a suggestion of the same features on the top, a sort of peripheral groove in the exterior. And when this is resolved more, you'll actually see a spiraling groove to the top of the structure. Well, this thing is about almost a mile across. This thing is only 520 feet across. And then, again, the Cydonia analog to the Avebury Circle, with the tetrahedral pyramid on its lip. And I call it a pyramid, but it isn't quite a regular pyramid. It looks almost organic, but The interesting thing about the Avery Circle is if you look at the old ordnance maps, this area here actually records a three-sided pyramid. And you can see it here closer. Three regular sides right next to the conflict. This is a poor picture, but the reason I have it is because it also demonstrates some more features that David Percy may have missed, and that's these circular features in the center and these regular mounds on the exterior, the interior of the exterior. If you were to reconstruct the Avery Circle, before it was destroyed in 1784 by locals who decided they'd use it as a quarry, by building fires around these stones and then pouring water on them to break them down, you would have seen the same features. And even the angle that's been drawn between here by Hogan himself and Percy is the same. The number 19.5 is enigmatic because it deals with a type of geometry that's tetrahedral. And the only way that you can actually explain it is if you have a sphere that's rotating so that it has an axis. And you place one of the vertices of the tetrahedron at a pole. If you're actually using a 360-degree system so that the equator is 0 and the poles are 90, each of the other vertices will touch 19.47. It's interesting. The Roswell incident actually happened in 1947. I don't think that's just by chance. And I'm sure that the ancient philosophers wouldn't think it's by chance because this is too important to have anything left to chance in the spiritual realm. There's a huge spiritual component to what's going on between Mars and Earth. 19.47, I think, actually demonstrates a conduit between two dimensions. A conduit between the spiritual and the material, and also the temporal. Because the tetrahedron is the first of the Platonic solids, the simplest and the most basic form of the Platonic solids, and the sphere is actually the highest form of the Platonic solids. It's actually what the planets have been designed with. You have the lowest and the highest merging at this point. 19.47. This fits into what any esoteric philosopher worth his salt would talk about in the litany that comes out of what they call the Emerald Tablets of Thoth. This is a legendary writing that was supposedly created before the deluge, before the flood. And it's been in extent for at least before the Common Era. What's interesting is it's been translated by people like Newton and Albert Magnus and Manly P. Hall and people who would consider themselves occult adepts. And I had never run into it until I actually started researching what some of the esoteric, what was called Hermetic lore was. Interesting thing about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, it does exist. It's only one page of information. You can find it on the internet at alchemical sites, people who are dealing with what they don't understand, but they collect the information nonetheless. And I actually printed it out. Secret Works of Hiram. This is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Where we heard that before. As below, so above, as above, so below. That's the key. If heaven can be mirrored to the earth, if heaven can be connected to the earth, then the early philosophers believed that power could also be theirs. They could avail themselves of these patterns. They could avail themselves of the power. It talks about how with this knowledge alone you may work miracles. It's all things exist in and emanate from the one who is the ultimate cause. That's Pythagorean. He talks about the monad. He talks about the first intelligence. So this is a combination of the Neoplatonic ideals, but it's interesting because this translation was by Falconelli, who's one of the last renowned alchemists And he attributes it to Hiram. And Hiram was actually a king of Tyre. And Tyre is a city, an ancient city, that existed in ancient Cydonia on earth. There's actually a Cydonia on earth. St. Albert Magnus, he was only canonized in 1931, but in 1280 he was writing in his Book of Minerals about the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, which he had translated. And he was talking about the as above, so below motif. And he said that the powers of all things below originate in the stars and constellations of the heavens, and all these powers are poured down into all things below by the first circle of the constellations. And you know that the constellations exist in a sphere outside our Earth, so the first circle would have to be the most important circle, that of the ecliptic, where we sight the sun moving across our skies. What he's saying is, somehow these symbols have been superimposed on the Earth. This is the key that unlocks what the Emerald Tablets of Thoth are talking about. It unlocks what the early philosophers were talking about, and it actually unlocks what's going on Mars. You can resolve all this connection idea further when you realize that the Greeks had a large amount of legend and myth surrounding how heaven exactly did meet with the Earth. And Homer wrote in his Odyssey about how Atlas, the Titan, who actually, before he became this poor demigod who held the heavens and earth apart, was a king of Atlantis. And that he was a magician, he knows the depths of the seas, and he held the tall pillars that kept the sky and the earth apart. So the idea of two pillars, one for the earth and one for heaven, was the salient point. And you can look into it even further, because the lore goes that Atlas was turned into mountains, and that he held the heavens and earth as an anchor point. And lo and behold, our own prime meridian runs through the Atlas Mountains in what was called ancient Libya. Ovid, Strabo, Diodorus Siculus, the early historians all talked about this. They all talked about how heaven met somewhere in the west. From Greece, they also talked about how there was a literal place that could be found where heaven and earth were connected. This is strange because this seems to be a modern convention to establish where the prime meridian was in 1884 at the Prime Meridian Conference in Washington. Having it going right over the Atlas Mountains is kind of astounding because it fits perfectly into the mythology about where heaven and earth connected. But there's other strange things too. Right here is the country of Mali, and that's the home of the Dogon tribe, the ones that the missionaries were established to learn had worshipped Sirius for hundreds of years and had a religion around the period of a dwarf star that orbited the main star, Sirius, and they talked about how its orbit took, I think it's 40 years, maybe less than that, but they had the period of orbit worked out. They had the period of its obliquity figured out. They also knew that there was a star to begin with, which hadn't been imaged until something like 20 years later. So, correctly, this is Atlas holding the pillars of heaven and earth, standing at the Atlas Mountains along the prime meridian. And if you look at the zodiac, the first circle of the constellations that Albert Magnus was talking about, you actually can find some pillars. All these glyphs are shorthand representations of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And this is Gemini. And Gemini is a very interesting symbol because directly underneath Gemini is Sirius. So this actually resolves somewhat why in Mali the Dogon tribe would have some sort of obsession with this idea that Sirius and beings from Sirius came to the earth, because it fits right into the cosmology and the mythology and the theurgy of the ancients. This would be how Atlas holds the heavens to the earth. This is how it's oriented then, according to the esoteric law, the esoteric hermetic concept that we haven't thought about for thousands of years. It's been understood in the highest illuminated echelons, the illuminated fraternities. I'm not going to name any of them, but it's esoteric, and because it is, it's a secret. It's not known. But here's the prime meridian. Alice is holding the pillars. Here's where the pillars are represented in the heavens. And this is what it would look like if you actually superimposed the heavens with the earth, using the zodiac as the first circle of the heavens, and anchoring it at the prime meridian. This looks a fairly bit like it's an arbitrary idea, but there's a lot of evidence to support that this actually exists. And it always goes back to Mars, and this is the most amazing part of this. If Sirius is the dog star, and it's Latin Canis Major, there is an incredible precedent for its naming. The etymology of the name canine actually goes back to Canaan. The Canaanites were also the Phoenicians. They were the greatest merchants and seafarers in the ancient times. Strabo said that their country was the oldest civilized country in the world. And in fact, he said that Cydonia, the first city of Canaan, was the oldest city in antiquity. It makes a lot of sense because in the Old Testament, in Genesis, where Noah landed on Mount Ararat, he had a son named Ham, and Ham had walked in on him after he'd gotten really drunk, and he was naked in his tent. Ham went out and told his brothers that Noah was in the state he was, and you don't do that to an ancient biblical patriarch, one who's an oracle for God. Everything that happens in his life actually speaks to God's interaction with man on earth. So his brothers went in and covered him up. Nakedness is something that is pretty symbolic because it goes right back to what was going on in the Garden of Eden, what the first sin actually caused men to lose. And Noah cursed Ham indirectly because he'd already blessed Ham. He couldn't curse him, so he cursed his son Canaan. And Canaan was the cursed of the first people who survived the deluge, if you can believe there was a deluge. The Greeks believed there was. Almost every ancient culture has their flood myth. So Canaan was the cursed one, and then actually the Semitic language Ha-Kenan actually means subservient, like a dog. And the Canaanites were called dogs, but the Canaanites found themselves again building right along Mount Hermon, which the ancient pseudepigraphic book of Enoch says that the sons of God came down, and actually these angels came down to the earth and started taking human women and breeding with them and creating giants. Or the word Nephilim in Semitic, the Semitic word Nephilim means the fallen ones. And they ended up right back where it all started to begin with. The flood epic starts in Genesis 6 with its story. Cydonia is named after Sidon. The city was actually founded first. Sidon was the first son of Canaan, and the ancient historians and chroniclers called the Canaanites Sidonians primarily. In the Bible, you'll see the word Phoenician, Canaanite, and Sidonian used almost interchangeably. Cydonia was the first capital. Strabo says that it was the origin of astronomy. It was the origin of trade. Money was first minted there, writing, all the arts, and all sorcery. This is a version of the K9, and it's interesting because in Egypt, there's actually a corollary between the Sidonians and the kings of Sidon, Apollodorus and Ovid. Talk of a guy named Agenor, the king of Sidon, who had two sons, and one of them was Cadmus, which means from the east. He was the one that found Thebes in Greece, and another son named Belus, who was a pharaoh in Egypt. And Egypt actually was his son. So that you have a corollary between the Egyptian culture and the Cydonia culture. Anubis is given the appellation, he who was over the secrets. The Canine religion is that heaven to earth religion where you've mirrored the heavens to the earth using the anchor point of Sirius. It's the point of time and space. This is a picture of how the timelines are used in Greenwich. And it literally is the anchor point where heaven meets the earth. This is in Greenwich. This is called the Flamsteed Ball. At 1 o'clock every afternoon, this Flamsteed Ball arrives at the top of the tower, and precisely at 1, a cannon shot will be heard and the ball will fall. And I often wondered why they would set their clock to 1 o'clock instead of any other time. But this gives you an understanding of why that is. Because as the heavens are mirrored to the earth, you only have 12 of the signs, 12 zodiac, but you have 24 hours. So 0-100 hours would be midnight, or 1 o'clock in the morning, and then 1 o'clock in the afternoon is 13, which lends a lot of understanding to why the number 13 seems to show up so much in occult lore. Not even the name of Greenwich has some theurgic significance. In New York, at least the New York police understand what it means in some way. And even though it isn't spelled perfectly like you would think the Greenwich would be spelled, but it actually has the same phonetic and the same sound to the word, and that is for a good reason. Even Britain is considered an agrarian goddess. Here she is with her worshippers, adorers looking at her fondly. She has her cornucopia, but she also is an illuminated woman. There's a lot of agrarian goddesses through history. This is Ceres or Demeter. She has her torch of illumination. She has her sheaf of grain. This is Inanna. She's holding ankhs, and she has wreaths of bull horns on her head. And she has a lot in common with Isis. She's holding an ankh, but Isis was the mother of Anubis. She was this mother of the dog. She was a symbol then of that star, actually Sirius, because Diodorus Siculus actually wrote that in his day in the Hellenistic Empire, the Greeks knew that she was the star that rose in the constellation of the dog, and that she was the first daughter of Kronos, first daughter of what we would say was time. Plutarch wrote that Isis, her name was from Isa in Greek to mean I know, and there's actually a biblical precedent for her name too as Isha, which is the first word used for wife. In all cases, the women, the agrarian goddesses, have names that fit a star. And we're talking the brightest star in the northern hemisphere. Isis, the star of Ishtar, it is all talking about the star from Canaan, the star that the Phoenicians used to navigate, the one that's easiest to sight, the one that you need to know about so that you can get from point A to point B, because you can't just sight the North Star and find out where you are on latitude. You have to be able to find where you are on a revolving Earth. So the fixed point, the benchmark, has to be in heaven. And the star underneath the yellow star is actually from the temple of Hathor in Dendera, Egypt. It's a symbol of Isis herself. You'll notice it's kind of anthropomorphic. It's not perfect. These sides are almost lateral, perpendicular to the ground, and these are at angles. So it almost looks like a person with their arms out. And this is on Cydonia. It's not a perfect pentagon either, but it follows that anthropomorphic sort of form. And the most amazing part of its theurgy is that it's a Cydonian star. It's actually been named in the place, it's been found in the place it was named after the fact, Cydonia, which is actually the name of the origin, at least for our understanding of it, on Earth. The place where culture, according to the ancient Greeks, and religion came from. There's another view of the heaven-earth mirror using a linear sort of perspective. So I combined these elements of a dog star that's simultaneously representing a goddess of knowledge and twins. And you come up with the founding myth of Rome. This is the Capitolian wolf feeding Romulus and Remus, who were the sons of Mars. So you see you're ending up back on Mars again. This is a religion that propagated from the first people who survived the flood, the first people who actually came in contact again with the remnants of the Nephilim who were left after the flood. They started right back up where they left off. And this is true because when the Israelites actually came into Canaan, they encountered the Nephilim again, or the descendants of the Nephilim. That's recorded in Exodus and in Joshua. So this is how they actually fit. The heavens actually fit over the earth, especially the ones I was talking about. They extend 15 degrees over the prime meridian each direction, so 30-degree swath from here to here. And you can see that Rome's right about there. Rome's these guys' footstool. There's a lot of other orthographic toponymy that you'll see here that represent how heaven connects to the earth. Over Cydonia, over where Turkey is, we're just talking about the lines that run from pole to pole there. Over Egypt, over Greece, Taurus is dominant. The bull is dominant. In Turkey, you find the Taurus Mountains. It's not just a coincidence. There's also the story of how Crete, the Minoan civilization, was founded, and the demigoddess that Europe is named after, and that's Europa. She was a Cydonia princess. She was the daughter of Agenor, the king of Sidon. She was abducted by Zeus, according to the myth, and taken to Crete. Zeus is in the form of a bull. She was abducted, and when Zeus grew tired of her, he married her off to one of the indigenous locals who was king at the time, named Asteres. And Asteres just means stars, so she became literally the queen of stars. So that refers back to Sirius again. What's really interesting about this map that I have up is that word, Cania. During the Byzantine Empire, there was a kind of back and forth pull of this land between the two capitals of Rome at the time. And finally, the Venetians came back here from Italy, so that Rome was in charge of it again. They named it Cana, but it had previously been named Cydonia. And the king of Cydonia was named Chidon, a corruption of the word Sidon. You can see here Kappa, an old form of iota, delta, omega, nu, Chidon. And here he is being suckled by a wolf, like Romulus and Remus were. The reason for that is because it's symbol. It's cryptography. It's the symbol of a religious system that was propagated with the indigenous people that moved outward from Sidon, that moved outward with their technology and their ability to travel on the seas like no other people could, because they had anchored the heavens to the earth. Underneath Taurus is Orion, and Orion is played very prominently in ancient history. The Minoan culture, they had the cult of the Minotaur, and Theseus here is dispatching the Minotaur. Osiris is known as Apis at times, so he wore the bull head but had a human body. So this is incorporating both the symbols of Taurus and Orion. And Orion is the brightest constellation in the northern hemisphere. Isis even shared a version of this bovine form too as Hathor. And that's the temple of Hathor and Dendra is where that star came from that I had previously on screen. This is bull jumping. The women in the Minoan culture were really into it. And the symbology escapes me a bit, but I think it's harkening back to the abduction of Europa herself and also the heaven to earth mirror. And even the name Europa leads us back to that first encounter of heavenly knowledge with the first human being on earth, because Euro in Greek means to perceive. And I put the Strong's number here because it's a pretty common Christian tool. It's a pretty common Christian lexicon to go look up and see that I'm not just throwing this out without thinking about it. It means to perceive or see or have something like your eyes open wide. And appa, or ops, from Europa, means eyes and is very closely related to the word snake. And I think this is a biblical precedent for it. That first encounter with the first human and the first extraterrestrial, an angel. The serpent said, "You surely not die if you eat the fruit, for God knows in the days you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." And it kind of explains for me why these statues that you always find of the goddesses in the Minoan cultures have just huge bug eyes with lapis lazuli placed in it, because lapis lazuli is a picture of our sky. It's blue, and it fits the word Europa perfectly. The one who perceives, the one who understands. It's Eve, the first one. That's a Gnostic paradigm that most people have never probably encountered. And getting back to the heaven-earth mirror, we have another picture of the agrarian goddess. This is Virgo. She's in heaven, so she has wings. She has a branch in one hand and a sheaf of grain in the other. Here's another rendition of her, again with the wings and the sheaf of grain and the branch. And here's her positioning over the earth. She dominates North America. I came across this interesting picture from some grimoire. It was probably around 1920. You can see the same features, the wings, the sheaf, the branch in her hand, and she defiantly points at North America, where she actually does in fact dominate. And even our capital has allusions to the idea of a virgin goddess, Virginia and Maryland bracketing Washington, D.C., the capital of Maryland being Annapolis, which is, Anna was the mother of Mary in the New Testament. Annapolis is just the city of Anna, or Anna actually means the promise. And here's your Cydonian star in Washington, where we propagate our control over the earth. Getting back to the heaven-earth mirror, you have Virgo, and underneath her, on the same longitude, Corvus pecking on a snake. If you superimpose that on the earth in the same longitude, you have it situated over Mexico, and there is a precedent there also. Interesting story. The god of war for the Aztecs had prophesied to some of his warriors that they should move from the northern place that they were, right beneath Texas, south. And they ended up finding this exact symbol, which was part of the prophecy. When they find the symbol of an eagle with a snake on a cactus, they would build a city. And they built their city right where Mexico City exists now, in a huge swamp, which lies exactly at 19.47 degrees latitude. This is where Leo dominates, pretty much the only continent. And South America is home to some of the most incredible megalithic monuments in the world, especially at Cusco, Peru, right here at 72 degrees west longitude. Here's a picture of one of the geomantic structures found at Cusco. This is the buildings at Sacsayhuaman that actually flow into the city of Cusco, Peru. There's a woman standing there for scale. Some of these stones are estimated to be 300 tons. They're fit so perfectly together that you can insert paper or even a razor blade between them. And because of their odd features, the incredible difficulty of actually coring something like this and fitting it boggle the mind. There aren't really any ways of explaining how it was done with modern architecture. She's standing in front of one tooth in a great mouth of teeth of a giant lion. So they literally represented what was above them in the heavens. The top picture is what the city would have looked like earlier, but lower, of course, modern ravages have diminished the shape of the puma, because the puma is the only great lion-like carnivore in South America. And speaking of animal shapes on the ground, this is the Ohio Serpent Mound. And I'm throwing it in here not because it actually represents so much what's above it in heaven, but because it actually is the key to it all. I've heard different explanations for what it's got in its mouth. One is that it's disgorging the cosmic egg of creation. The other is that it's chasing the North Star. I don't think so. I also stumbled across this interesting picture of just an old Rand McNally map from 1895 of Montana. And it kind of hit home because I live right there. And if you noticed already, Lewis and Clark County looks very serpentine, and there's been very much trouble to make Jefferson County look like this round thing in its mouth. Here's a little bit of enhancement. I thought about it for a long time, and I finally realized that if I wanted to get to the genesis of it, I'd have to go back to Genesis. A snake doesn't have any arms, so in order to hand off this symbol of knowledge from heaven, it extends itself. And that's a handoff, and that's the agrarian goddess thinking about actually taking a bite of it. And then here's where things get theurgically very interesting. The picture that you saw and this fruit that you're looking at now have a fivefold nature. You see, as you cut it through its equator, it actually demonstrates a pentagon, or a pentagram. And in the Renaissance, when knowledge became available again, painters seem to represent the same fruit over and over again in the same way, golden. And in the Greek times, in the stories of all the golden fruit myths, there was no cultivars that were like yellow apples. And the historians say that the golden apples they couldn't have been citrus fruit, they couldn't have been an orange. It always ends up looking the same, and the fruit is the Cydonia, botanically Pyrus Cydonia, the quince. Leading you right back again to what we saw on Mars, artificial structures. Here, Hercules went to Atlas to look for the golden apples on his 11th labor. And the number 11 actually is another symbol for pillars. And to have this golden fruit associated with Hercules and Atlas brings us to the idea that there really is something about this idea of circumscribing a pentagram with an equator. The fruit has a big key to how heaven and earth are connected. So I circumscribed the earth with a pentagram. Well, I circumscribed the pentagram with the equator of the earth, rather. And lo and behold, every place a vertices touch is where a megalithic site exists. The biggest mounds ever found, the biggest monoliths, every single place. And especially here, Baalbek in Cydonia, Lebanon. This is the pregnant stone, as they call it, but the locals call it, in Baalbek, Cydonia. It's approximately 72 feet long by 14 feet high. This one was never fully quarried. It's still stuck to the bedrock, but it's estimated to weigh 1,400 tons. This is called the Baalbek Trilithon. These stones that are incorporated into it are slightly smaller. They're maybe 1,100 tons each. But they're lifted 20 feet off the ground. And they're also placed with exactitude, something that cannot be done today. Above it you see Phoenician architecture, and then Greek, and then Roman. And contemporary historians say the Romans built it. I don't think so either. These are men for scale. There's another picture of the whole complex of the Trilithon. You can see the trouble, actually, that later people had trying to put the incumbent masonry over the top of what they actually had here first. And the locals say that that structure, the platform itself, was built before the flood, and then it was built by Cain himself in a fit of raving madness. What was interesting about that first star that I showed you, it doesn't touch Giza. It doesn't touch the Great Pyramid, which is one of the remaining 7 wonders of the world. And I realized that the twin pillars fit into the Gnostic dualistic concepts of how heaven is married to the earth. So maybe there was a second star. Maybe there's an Osiris star. Graham Hancock and Bouval have actually theorized that the pyramids are laid out like the belt of Orion. So I put another star where Giza is, and we actually find all the rest of the places where the megaliths exist on this earth. Mohenjo-Daro, Pakistan. You have Fiji. There's great megalithic sites there. At these vertices here, you actually find megaliths. You find the Tahiti pyramids exactly on the 149th meridian. And that strange image I was talking about, right here on the 113th, right where I live, right there, is the vertices of that point. And Washington, D.C. is at 77, right there. It's also interesting that the myth and the symbol that fits into this harkens right back again to Cydonia on earth, because Phoenix was actually a son of Agenor, and the Phoenicians were Sidonians. And if you draw a line directly from the 113th meridian, you'll go to Phoenix, Arizona. And Phoenix, Arizona lies on the 33rd parallel. So does Cydonia. In fact, Sidon is exactly on the 33rd parallel, and so is Roswell. So this is what it would look like if you put the 2 stars anchored on the prime meridian and one on Cairo. And you can see where all the points are. And anyone can do that and actually predict where they'll find the most ancient ruins, the biggest ruins, and all the megalithic sites of the earth. And I've highlighted Cairo, which in the Old Arabic meant city of Mars, and Baalbek, Cydonia. These 2 places are divided by 5 degrees exactly, which is redundant to the whole idea of the pentagon, pentagram, earth, heaven, earth coordination system. And you have the occult symbol of a circumscribed pentagram. This is a talisman by Eliphas Levi, and it goes even farther into the cosmology and the understanding of heaven to earth. This actually is a talisman that describes how we're oriented in space, believe it or not. The Hebrew letters that surround here are Leviathan. In Christian understanding, Leviathan is a great serpent that lives in the sea, and he frolics there. He's talked about by Job, and he's kind of enigmatic. But to the Hebrews, they actually understand him as being a giant serpent that lives in space, connected to time somehow, and also biting his own tail. And this is the breakdown of the composite word Leviathan, and it actually means the serpent that's connected. Eliphas Levi actually did his homework, drew this picture so that we don't have to understand Hebrew. Even modern Jewish postcards actually show Leviathan in its correct form. And you can see the word under here again, Leviathan. But instead of a snake, they have a fish. I think that's a carp. This is an Aztec form of Leviathan. Chinese. This is on a Masonic gravestone. This is Leviathan. This is the center of the Milky Way. This is his body and his head going this direction, his eye, and his tail going into his mouth here. This is a little orthified, more resolved version of Leviathan eating his tail at the galactic central point. It's interesting that even Poseidon was known as a serpent that ate his tail, and he was first known as Okeanos. And I looked all over for an etymological origin for the word Poseidon, and I got all sorts of things like Great Father or Ocean God, which didn't make much sense. But one really good explanation is that it's a sentence in Greek, aposeidon, which means from Sidon. So it's actually this idea of understanding how heaven and earth relate, how heaven and earth actually interact, so that heaven acts as a gigantic chronometer that can actually predict where we are in the ages. So this idea of a circumscribed pentagram is extremely old, and it's actually an equation that will demonstrate how earth and heavens are aligned. 360 degrees of the circle around the pentagram actually create an equation, because in a regular pentagram or pentagon, you have 72 degrees between each of the 5 points. By multiplying it, you get 25,920 years, which is exactly what Plato said was the Platonic year, the year that took for the earth to make one circuited the precession of the equinoxes. Many people don't understand what the precession is. It's pretty simple. The earth revolves around its axis. It also goes around the sun. But because it's at an angle, it has obliquity. We have seasons, so as it travels around the sun once in 365 days, the northern hemisphere here will get more sun during our summer, and the southern hemisphere gets more during the summer down in Australia, where we get winter. But what also is happening is this axis spins like a wobbly top, but it doesn't spin very fast. In fact, it takes 72 years to move just 1 degree. And so it points at these north stars, that these stars actually trade off being the North Pole over 25,920 years. But also while that's happening, when we have spring, the beginning of our year, during the vernal equinox, we move along the zodiac. And it will take 25,920 years to move one time. This is supposedly the Ring of Solomon, and I put it up because it has 4 fins on it. Here is the Ouroboros. This is another word for the Leviathan. Ouroboros, the tail-eating serpent of the Greeks, but he has 4 fins. And the reason that he has 4 fins, according to the Jewish sages, is because he supports the cosmos on it. It makes sense because there are actually 4 points to the ecliptic. You have in Leo Regulus, the brightest star, in that quadrant, Fomalhaut in Aquarius, in Taurus, the bull, Aldebaran, Antares, and Scorpio. All these 4 points are aligned equally across the ecliptic. And they are part of another mystical symbol. If you combine their points together, you actually get a composite being with 4 faces. It's the origin for the type of the cherubim that Ezekiel is talking about. And so the Greeks understood that there were points during the ecliptic, during the Platonic year, that we would actually align ourselves with them. They called the spaces between each of these cherubic points aeons, and they called the points between exactly right before we moved into the next aeon, the dividing point, the word centelia. When the Israelites were in the desert, they would align themselves around the camp, and they each had ensigns or flags with them. And these flags actually coordinate to the zodiac. This is an important picture because you have Leviathan here. And as the precession of the equinox work through the Platonic year, Leviathan will appear right before the cherubic point, the lion. And here, this is part of a corrupted symbol. It used to be Ophiuchus, the serpent holder. He's stepping on the scorpion, so the Greeks have it just kind of abbreviated. Here's the man, and here's the bull. But every time we move from here to here to here, it would take 6,480 years, a little over 6,000 years, every time. And that's the length of an aeon. And every time we do that, there would be a sign that would show that we move into the aeon. At a vernal equinox, or at a solstice, or at the autumnal equinox, or anytime we'd have an equinox or solstice, this could be seen during that point between the aeons. The sun will rise exactly in the mouth of this snake, this Leviathan, and it will herald the new aeon that lasts 6,000 plus years. And the strange thing about that is the ecliptic just happens, when we sight the sun, just happens to go right through the mouth. This sign actually lasts for about 900 years. It actually lasts long enough that you can get a really good idea of just about where it occurred. I left it at 2012 because there's so much lore around the idea of the Aztec calendar ending there, but just as a benchmark, if you move back 6,480 years to get this symbol at either a solstice or a equinox, you end up at the birth of written history. And if you go back another 6,000 years plus, you end up at a place where the geologic time, Pleistocene, and then the Holocene begins. And those are marked by massive die-offs. A geologist will mark a new epoch by how much dead things he finds in the strata. That marks a huge die-off of most of the animals in the North American continent. And you can continue backwards along these aeons. You can actually mark where they occur. We're moving into the age of Aquarius now. That would be in the spring. We'd actually see the sunrise in right about where Aquarius is, the first degree. But Taurus was there before. And interesting, Graham Hancock and Bivol talk about the pyramid being aligned so that it would be looking at this age, the age of Leo. And they say that there was a great cataclysm there. It's my take that that's the time of the flood and the rebuilding of civilization. You go back 6,000 years before that, glaciers were at a maximum. And interestingly, at the beginning of the whole Platonic year itself, it said that all hominids except Homo sapiens had died out. And there's a picture of the Centennial again, that marking between each aeon, which is actually happening now during our winter solstice. You can go outside right before the sun rises on the 21st of December and see it. It adds to the understanding of the mystery of what these things represent, because they're a timepiece. They demonstrate when the event happened. Okay. They have peripheral ditches around them, and they actually show in a structural form that idea of the celestial hemisphere rising the Earth's hemisphere rising in the celestial sea. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the first time. And there's also a biblical precedent for the idea of a mound, or the building of a mound. In Exodus 24. Mostly built out of the earth. Because I don't have enough time to really cover exactly what I wanted to, this is just very quickly going through the idea that it has much more about it than just how earth and heaven are oriented. It has the cosmology of the ancients, the idea of the afterlife, the traveling to the portal of the River of Souls on the Milky Way, the actual indicator of where that opening is in the mouth of the Ouroboros, the only symbol on the ecliptic that has an arrow point, which was the payment, the obelisk that was paid to Charon to get into it, was at the mouth of the Ouroboros, and that this is understood by most of the ancients. It's even drawn here in the Middle Age manuscript of a zodiac. This is Nergal. He actually is a really early form of Sagittarius, and he marks where the opening of the mouth of the Ouroboros is. And Nergal was a Sumerian god for Mars. And at that most sacred place in the heavens, you have Nergal shooting his arrow through the mouth of the Ouroboros, directly at the heart of Antares. And each one of these names point back to Mars again. Antares just means comparable to Mars. Poseidon meaning from Sidon. On the other side of the ecliptic, the only other place that touches the Ouroboros or the Milky Way, you have the gate that keeps people out. If you're a Greek and you're a dead soul, you're traveling on the river of souls, this is the point where you can't escape. The three dogs, Procyon, Canis Minor, Canis Major, and also Lepus, the enemy under Orion, may be the precedent for the idea of Cerberus, the guardian. Here's a picture of the face. This was in April 6, 98, from the Mars Global Surveyor. It's pathetic. It didn't work at all. And I think it was directly obfuscated because if you waited until 2001 in January, you would have seen this. Very regular features, very geometric. Richard Holden had said that it was actually lie-faced, that it had two features. One was human and the other side was lion. Which makes a lot of sense because if you actually superimpose a lion on one side and a man on the other, you'll see some very interesting regular features of the eye, the square part of the nose, the mouth, the chin. It's uncanny. And there's a biblical precedent. Ezekiel actually saw this in a prophecy. He was talking about the temple that hasn't been built yet, but he talks about a cherubim that had two faces and that they were part of the same being, that they were decorated within the holy place of the temple completely in a circle. And interesting, opposed to each other here in the ecliptic is the lion and the man that compose the cherubim, and that is because if you think about when the flood happened, which I believe the flood happened at this point 10,500 years ago, we're in the days exactly as in Noah, linearly across. We're actually in the same point in time where we're moving into the next aeon. Here's a picture of the inside of the Temple of Solomon. And you can see what they have as cherubim, composite beings, wings of an eagle, four parts of a lion, back parts of a bull, and head of a man. Here's the Holy of Holies. And my last pictures here are of Hiram, who was supposedly the king of Tyre, which was the capital of Cydonia at the time. He was the one that Solomon had brought to help build his first temple. And so by applying the theurgy of the ancients to what's going on here, he's the addressee of one of the most descriptive parts of the Bible, Ezekiel 28, about Satan. Son of man, take up a lamentation over the king of Tyre and tell him, thus says the Lord God, you seal up the sum, full of wisdom and perfection and beauty. You were in Eden in the garden of God. I know Hiram wasn't. You were the anointed cherub who covers. You walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. You were perfect in your ways until the day that you were created. Until unrighteousness was found in you, therefore. I have destroyed you, covering cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. You have profaned your sanctuaries. There I have brought fire from your midst. And these are sanctuaries, and they are decimated. And the very next sentence is Sidon, a prophecy for Sidon. And the Lord says, behold, I'm against you, Sidon. I will be glorified in the midst of you, and they shall know that I am the Lord when I have executed my judgments in her and shall be sanctified in her. I really feel like what's going on in Mars right now will be understood in the mainstream. It'll be a household word. I think that in the very near future, there will be the understanding that what's on Cydonia is real. But it's completely different than having someone discover that there's extraterrestrial life out there that we have no idea of what it is or how it existed. Because what it actually says about us is that it's where we came from in our civilization. And that's very difficult to try to absorb as a Christian, because I know that's not where we came from, but I also believe that they had a huge impact on how civilization was formed to begin with. That's a paradox that can't be resolved. If you're already going towards the New Age version or the Gnostic version, you'll find this information to edify and uplift your belief system. As a Christian, I find this as a warning of what the actual end-time delusion is going to be. And there will be an end-time delusion that's so powerful that even Christians will fall away, because they won't be able to validate what they've been reading in the Bible because they haven't done this study. So, I hope you understood it even in its abbreviated form. But there will be a lot more about this in the near future, and I do have a book, which is a little bit easier to read because you can take your time whenever you want to read it. Go over it and over it. Thanks a lot for your time.